So, as the gun smoke cleared on the 1st of June 1916, what exactly had happened at the Battle of Jutland? Who'd won? Who'd lost? And what outcome and impact would there be as a result of it on the overall war? Well, the outcome of the battle was not immediately clear to either side, and indeed, propaganda would start almost immediately. In this respect, the Germans were first off the mark. Even as Seydlitz was resting her battered bones on the bottom of the harbour on 2nd of June 1916, the German government released a statement to the world's press announcing a great victory, acknowledging only the loss of Pommern and Wiesbaden in exchange for the apparent sinking of a British battleship, 2 battle cruisers, 2 armoured cruisers, a light cruiser, a submarine from somewhere, and some destroyers, which, curiously, was actually completely at odds with Scheer's own estimation, which was that his forces had managed to sink Warspite, 3 battle cruisers, 4 armoured cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 13 destroyers. Nevertheless, national celebrations and a children's holiday were announced, a stance which would be the official German narrative well into the 1950s. With the Royal Navy having to trek all the way back across the North Sea, the British were not able to count their losses quite as quickly, and the early release of damaged vessels to return home compounded the situation, as around the same time that the Germans were broadcasting their triumph, all the civilians on the UK's east coast could see were a few battered and listing vessels limping home, which seemed to give credence to the German claims. As the rest of the fleet arrived and crews went ashore, a steady trickle of telegrams and phone calls began to work their way across the country, with inevitable confusion, as some would arrive home to find well-meaning friends had reported them dead already. Warspite, one of the first battleships to make it back to port, was pelted with coal and insults from the bridge that it passed under on its way in for repairs. In the evening of the same day, the Admiralty released a preliminary estimate of losses based on Jellicoe's reports. Of course, British losses were by then pretty much known, whilst estimates of German losses were much harder to accurately gauge since many of them had occurred in the night. But the British press, expecting Jutland to have been a second Trafalgar, took the minimal information as some form of cover-up and secrecy and ran with the German narrative, prompting the release on the 3rd of June of another, and then later on the same day a third estimate of German losses, each larger than the previous one. Eventually, the Admiralty would claim 2 dreadnought battleships and 1 pre-dreadnought battleship definitely sunk, with another dreadnought battleship and a battlecruiser, or possibly 2 further dreadnought battleships as probably sunk, along with 5 light cruisers, 9 torpedo boats, of which 3 were considered probable only, and 4 submarines, with 3 of these being considered probable only. Still, the German narrative held sway for most of the week, until on the 7th, unable to conceal it any longer, the High Seas Fleet also admitted the loss of Lützow and Rostock, although the loss of Elbing was still withheld, possibly due to the embarrassing nature of the loss to one of her own side. This began to change public opinion, as the Admiralty's release of British losses roughly coincided with or even exceeded German claims, with the caveat of the capital ship losses being 3 battlecruisers and not a dreadnought battleship and 2 battlecruisers, whilst the German admission that they'd been hiding some losses badly dented their credibility and even persuaded many to believe some of the Admiralty's somewhat more speculative claims. Thus, by the end of June, the international press was moving towards the sense of a partial British victory, enhanced by further information that showed that the battle had ended with the High Seas Fleet running for port and the Grand Fleet off the German coast looking for a fight, with the ditty run in one newspaper of "The Germans cry we've won, but 'tis a curious view, when it is the conquerors that run, and the vanquished that pursue." Or, as one American newspaper rather unsubtly put it, "The prisoner has assaulted his jailer, but is still in jail." By July, the far worse loss of life at the Battle of the Somme put the ongoing argument out of most people's minds for the time being. But, in truth, what had actually happened? In terms of casualties, the British had undoubtedly come off worse, with 6,784 killed against 3,039 on the German side, the bulk of deaths on both sides being from ships that had gone down with all hands, or near enough. The British had also lost 113,300 tonnes of shipping against 62,300 tonnes on the German side, with the actual true losses consisting of, on the British side, the battle cruisers Indefatigable, Queen Mary and Invincible, the armoured cruisers Black Prince, Warrior and Defence, the flotilla leader Tipperary, and the destroyers Shark, Sparrowhawk, Turbulent, Ardent, Fortune, Nomad and Nestor. On the German side, they had lost the battlecruiser Lützow, the pre-dreadnought battleship Pommern, the light cruisers Frauenlob, Elbing, Rostock and Wiesbaden, and the destroyers or heavy torpedo boats V-48, S-35, V-27, V-4 and V-29. However, the damaged capital ships told a different story. In terms of capital ships, the British vessels that were damaged and in need of repair were the battleships Barham, Warspite, Malaya, Colossus and Marlborough, and the battlecruisers Lion, Princess Royal, Tiger and New Zealand. Although of all of these, Colossus and New Zealand were only superficially damaged and could put to sea immediately again if needed. On the German side, the damage consisted of the battleships König, Großer Kurfürst, Markgraf, Kaiser, Helgoland and Schleswig-Holstein, all in need of repairs, along with the battlecruisers Derflinger, Seydlitz, Moltke and von der Tann, also likewise out of action. But on top of this, not counting cruisers and below, the time needed for repair was also very different. The day after the battle, the Royal Navy could still field 23 battleships and 4 battlecruisers and signalled itself ready for action. The German fleet was down to 10 operational battleships and no battlecruisers, and would not be able to sail for quite some time. By the end of the month, HMS Queen Elizabeth, Emperor of India, and HMAS Australia, all of whom had missed the battle, were back on the front line, as was HMS Royal Sovereign, which had just finished working up, leaving the British battle line actually stronger than it had been before the fight. Over July, Princess Royal, Barham, Tiger, and unbelievably Warspite came back into the fleet, with Lion following soon after, albeit still missing Q-turret. Whilst many of the German ships would also come back into action over these 2 months, a number, including several of the battlecruisers, would remain under repair for several months further. There would be no replacement for the lost Lützow until the next year when SMS Hindenburg was commissioned, and the only additional battleship of 1916 would be the Bayern, whilst the British would add the battleship Resolution to the ranks alongside the battlecruisers Renown and Repulse, with Ramillies arriving in 1917. In this respect, then, despite the greater losses inflicted, it was the High Seas Fleet that ended up at an overall greater numerical disadvantage after the battle for the rest of 1916, compounded by Scheer's understandable insistence that, apart from anything else, the battle had proved the pre-dreadnoughts should never sail with the High Seas Fleet again. Strategically, Scheer was very clear to his superiors the High Seas Fleet could not weather another battle like that, and with a summer excursion almost intercepted by the Grand Fleet again, he abandoned the idea of going after an isolated part of it. The Royal Navy was clearly wise to the tactic, and he had no intention of fighting the whole Grand Fleet in another set-piece battle. Instead, he would send portions of the High Seas Fleet after the Russians in 1917 and ramp up submarine warfare against the British instead. In terms of who won, then, there is no direct and unequivocal answer. On the strategic level, the British held the field at the end of the fighting, they still held control of the sea, and they had the stronger fleet the day after, and they deterred most of the further German efforts at contesting any of these. They also maintained the blockade of Germany, which would continue to have significant impacts on the German war industry and food supply. But, at the same time, the German fleet still existed in a fair amount of strength and had not suffered massive losses in the action, meaning that the Grand Fleet and the battlecruiser fleet would still largely be confined to keeping an eye on the Germans for the rest of the war, instead of being able to act more directly elsewhere. Tactically, it's easy to point to overall losses and say that it's a flat-out loss for the British. However, as with the strategic side, it's actually, at least in my opinion, more nuanced than that. You really had 4 fleets at sea: the High Seas Fleet, First Scouting Group, the Battlecruiser Fleet, and the Grand Fleet, under Scheer, Hipper, Beatty and Jellicoe respectively, and they fought some very separate actions. Whilst the various phases of the battle can be divided up in various ways, one of the more common sets of division is the run to the south, the run to the north, the First Fleet action, the Second Fleet action, and the night actions. But I think there's another way to look at it. Beatty versus Hipper, and Jellicoe versus Scheer. Now, the latter part, which comprises the last 3 phases of the traditional breakup of the battle, does include the battlecruisers of both sides and their commanders, but they're now in subordinate roles, whereas in the first 2 phases, it's basically Beatty versus Hipper. If we split those 2 actions at the point where the Grand Fleet opens fire at the High Seas Fleet at 1831, then the score, if you like, in the Beatty versus Hipper fight is British losses: the battlecruisers Indefatigable, Queen Mary and Invincible, the armoured cruisers Black Prince and Warrior, and the destroyers Shark, Nomad and Nestor. Whereas on the German side, they lose the light cruiser Wiesbaden and the destroyers V-27 and V-29. In addition, the British have Barham, Warspite, Malaya, Lion, Princess Royal, Tiger and New Zealand all damaged, whilst on the German side, Lützow is badly damaged, with Derfflinger, Seydlitz, Moltke and von der Tann taking varying degrees of damage. After 1831, when it becomes Jellicoe versus Scheer, the British lose the armoured cruiser Black Prince, the flotilla leader Tipperary, and the destroyers Sparrowhawk, Turbulent, Ardent and Fortune. Whereas the Germans lose the battlecruiser Lützow, the pre-dreadnought Pommern, the light cruisers Frauenlob, Elbing and Rostock, and the destroyers V-28, S-35 and V-4. Damage-wise, the British have light damage to HMS Colossus and serious damage to HMS Marlborough, whilst on the German side, the battleships König, Großer Kurfürst, Markgraf, Kaiser, Helgoland and Schleswig-Holstein are all damaged, and the battlecruisers Derfflinger, Seydlitz, Moltke and von der Tann are also all heavily damaged. Thus, I would argue that Jutland, tactically speaking, was a game of 2 halves. Hipper decisively won the first half against Beatty, but Jellicoe equally decisively won the second half against Scheer. Now, with that said, there were definitely technical lessons to be learned by all parties once the smoke had cleared. On the British side, a few major problems were identified: shell performance, communications, and the distressing habit of a number of ships to violently disassemble themselves when under fire. And there was a slightly less urgent but still identified area for improvement in gunnery as well, especially amongst the battlecruisers. Shell performance was worrying. Plenty of hits had been seen, and large fireballs resulting from these had been truly impressive, which led many to think that quite a few more German ships had been sunk than was actually the case, since a penetrating hit that generated that kind of explosion would surely have been fatal. The German habit of zigzagging under fire, and a number of their ships' propensity to heal quite considerably when doing so, contributed to this perception, as British observers would see what appeared to be a devastating hit or series of hits, followed by the German ship appearing to swerve out of line with a pronounced list, which they took as a sure indication of massive and rapid internal flooding. In fact, the increased heel of some ships was combining with a British shell failure. Specifically, many of the shells were detonating either near enough, on contact, or very shortly after starting to penetrate, which meant that the majority of their explosive power was being wasted into the air, which was the cause of the large explosions that the British observed, as opposed to getting deep into the ship and touching off some much larger detonation, only some of which would escape through the shell hole, and thus the 2 possible scenarios looked similar from a distance, and the British, not knowing about the shell performance issues, assumed the latter. The cause of this was twofold. In some respects, and at some angles of fall, especially at longer ranges, the British shells were too brittle and would just shatter, But more generally, at the closer ranges that much of the gunfire had been exerted at, the lyddite explosive that was used as the bursting charge was very powerful, but also highly sensitive. In a normal armour-piercing shell, the main charge should be relatively shockproof, requiring a fuse detonator to set it off. This fuse can then be set with a delay, which allows it to be initiated by impact, but only go off once the shell has gotten deeper into the target. However, it turned out that lyddite was so sensitive it could be initiated by the shock of impact without any reference to the fuse. As a result, several dozen hits to German belt, barbette and turret armour that by all rights should have punched through and dealt horrendous damage to their targets by blowing open their sides, shattering their boilers and engines, tearing into magazines or blowing apart turrets, merely, quote-unquote, stove in outer plates, broke off chunks of armour, or knocked turrets out of action, allowing the German ships to stay alive and, in many cases, stay fighting, in a few instances even bringing disabled guns back into action after some work whilst under fire. This issue alone, if properly addressed, had the potential to completely rewrite the table of losses for the battle, with one later analysis concluding that possibly up to half a dozen more German capital ships might have been sent to the bottom if proper shells had been used. But sadly, this wasn't entirely a new discovery. Jellicoe, back when he was 3rd Sea Lord at the height of the pre-war naval arms race, had recognised a number of these issues during gunnery trials and asked the Ordnance Board for new shells that corrected these issues to be developed. However, the issue had not been fully resolved by the time Jellicoe was assigned to a new post a few months later, and his successors had failed to follow up on the problem. The Germans themselves, upon analysis of the damage to their ships, recognised just how many lucky escapes they had enjoyed, with Hipper apparently later commenting that it was nothing but the poor quality of their bursting charges which saved us from disaster. Talk of British shell ineffectiveness rapidly became a point of laughter at German naval officers' gatherings, which gradually filtered through to the British via various shared social contacts in neutral navies. In a rather sad case of inertia, the Admiralty did not take this issue fully to heart, and it would only be when Jellicoe was promoted to 1st Sea Lord at the end of 1916 that he was able to take effective action, reallocating the existing shells to move the worst offenders into reserve, and starting the process of development on what would eventually become known as the Green Boy shells, which would eventually reach the fleet in early 1918, just in time for the last stand of the High Seas Fleet to not happen. Post-war, tests of these shells against the German battleship Baden showed the new type to have considerably improved performance. Communications was a vexing issue. Aside from the unspoken need to actually have signal officers who knew what they were doing, as the level of clarity and compliance with flag signals in basically every part of the Royal Navy that wasn't taking orders from HMS Lion had been a lot higher. That aside, there was a general acknowledgement that with so many ships spaced out over such distances, especially once funnel and gun smoke got involved, reading signal flags was somewhat difficult at the best of times before the gloomy weather and later darkness of the battlefield weighed in on top of that. Many of these same issues were present in the default backup to the signal flag, the signal lamp, which had the added hazard of being incidentally readable by the enemy, especially at night. This had allowed a number of German ships to get far closer without being fired upon than they should have by any rights, as well as the small side issue of the signal lamp pointing out exactly where you happen to be. Whilst radio was relatively widespread in the Grand Fleet, there had been a general reluctance to use it, which stemmed from an overextension of the relatively sensible policy of minimising radio signals during general sailing to reduce the chances of intercepts by the enemy, whereas the Germans' much more liberal use of radio worked out better for them in battle, but at the same time was what had led to the Grand Fleet knowing that they were at sea in the first place. There was also the possibility of German jamming, and especially in the night action, a general reluctance to actually communicate with the higher echelons of command when it was mistakenly thought that they could see what was going on themselves. Or indeed, for many of those officers to actually show real initiative, with the exceptions of desperate situations such as Windy Corner, or officers like Sturdy who were kept close to the centre of the fleet because it was felt he was a little too free-thinking. All of this would lead to a series of reforms, including new signals, greater freedom of action for squadron commanders, and explicit instructions to report what was seen, as well as exercise more independent thinking at all times, although many of these cultural changes would be more gradual and incremental than some of the more easily addressed purely technical issues. But perhaps the most immediate issue was why had 3 battlecruisers and 2 armoured cruisers detonated like gigantic floating bombs, with 1 or 2 other ships such as Lion only narrowly avoiding a similar fate. Here, the issues were many and complicated, not helped by a confusion of information, in part deliberate and in part accidental, in the years following the battle. And if that wasn't enough, even once that's all resolved, the details of the big ship losses are still not entirely uniform. A lot of coverage was given at the time, and later on, to apparent problems with the lack of armour on British battlecruisers of the time, and this was then conflated at some point to saying that the deck armour was insufficient. Well, this latter point can be immediately debunked. On no surviving ship was the deck armour ever breached, and indeed, when you calculate the angle of fall of shot, as well as the armour penetration and the range that the shots were being exchanged at Jutland, it becomes rapidly apparent that deck armour penetrations become not just exceedingly unlikely, but near enough physically impossible in almost all considered instances. The ranges involved too close and the angles of fall too shallow for a hazard to even be present on the relatively thin deck plating of World War I era capital ships. Belt and turret armour was a different matter, though. Although there were 2 sides to the battlecruiser engagement, there were really 3 broad families of ship design present at the time. The German ships were a fairly clear linear escalation of protection and firepower starting from Von der Tann. But the British contingent had 2 very different types of battlecruiser. The Invincible and Indefatigable classes were originally called Dreadnought Armoured Cruisers for a reason. They had no better protection in general than the armoured cruisers they replaced. In fact, the main turret faces were an inch thinner, and the Indefatigable's belt armour was in some places thinner than the Minotaurs and Warriors. Their protection was comprehensive against 5.9-inch or 8.2-inch shells if fired at a distance, which, to be fair, is what they were designed to fight and therefore to resist. But their 12-inch guns had prompted the Germans to build their own ships with that much larger calibre of shell in mind, and in return the German 11 and 12-inch gunfire was eminently capable of punching through any part of these 2 older ships' vertical armour at any range that the German guns could actually range out to, and later the ranges they could realistically expect to score hits, assuming broadside impacts, of course. Conversely, the British response to the German response, the Lion, Princess Royal, Queen Mary, and Tiger, whilst not as heavily armoured as the German ships, did at least have 9 inches of armour on their main belt and turret faces, which was generally enough to stop an 11-inch shell at most reasonable ranges, and a 12-inch shell at medium to longer battle ranges, which was borne out in the absolute battering ships like Tiger experienced without any major breach of their protective systems. Thus, a general, British battlecruisers were far too weakly armoured assertion is lazy and not in keeping with the facts. However, the earlier battlecruisers were very vulnerable to penetrations, and that certainly didn't help. But in the end, the main problem was a combination of the propellants used and how they were handled. Both sides had entered the war with propellants that were somewhat at risk of burning uncontrollably in the event of a hit. Indeed, SMS Seydlitz had come within a hair of blowing itself up at the Battle of Dogger Bank when it had taken a hit because of this factor. But the British hadn't suffered such a hit in that or other similar engagements, and so the chance to learn a direct lesson before Jutland was missed. In addition, the British propellant, which consisted of various mixes of cordite, suffered from a number of issues. Whilst it was very energetic and thus hurled shells with considerable enthusiasm, the stabilising agents deteriorated over time, and these would gradually leak crystals and dust of extremely flammable byproducts such as nitrocellulose. It was also stored in silk bags instead of metal casings for the most part, but These risks were manageable, and the ships had gone into service with a system of flash doors designed to block the propagation of the igniting flash of an explosion taking place somewhere near the magazines, along with strict controls about how many charges were allowed outside the magazine at any given time, as well as monitoring and replacement protocols for degraded cordite. But then the war started, and in a rather convoluted way, the lack of major modern coastal fortifications began a process that would end in multiple fatal magazine explosions. Because the coast was exposed, the first scouting group began raids designed to draw out the British fleet. And without fortifications, the British had to respond with capital ships. But Scapa Flow was too far away to protect Scarborough, even with Room 40 coming online. And so the fastest ships, the battlecruiser fleet, were moved further south to Rosyth, where they could be closer and they would thus be able to counter the German raids. Whilst Scapa Flow was a vast anchorage in the middle of practically nowhere at the time, this allowed the Grand Fleet to conduct regular gunnery practice. But the battlecruiser fleet's new home was in the Firth of Forth, the estuary of the River Forth, near Edinburgh. Not only was this body of water far too narrow to allow long-range gunnery practice, but the sounds of heavy naval gunfire and the resulting explosions would not have gone down too well with the local residents. Heading out to sea for gunnery practice on a regular basis was both expensive and somewhat dangerous, the various encounters with U-boats and mines resulting in the loss of HMS Aboukir, Hogue, Cressy and Audacious, weighing rather heavily on any decision to deploy outside of battle in those early years of the war. This in turn led to a degradation in the battlecruiser fleet's ability to conduct accurate long-range gunnery, and so a substitute was found that also seemed to suit the conditions of the anchorage: rate of fire. Specifically, the practice of making good long-range gunnery estimates quickly couldn't be maintained. Then, it was reasoned, the ability to rapidly fire the guns would make up for this, as multiple half-salvos in quick succession would in theory allow a ship to walk its shells onto the target in about the same time that a slower and more precise vessel might find the range by the normal method. However, this rate of fire exceeded the speed at which the various flash doors and interlocks allowed fresh ammunition to be brought up from the magazines, and so these safety devices, depending on which report you believe, were either removed or wedged open in order to let shells and charges pass faster. This still wasn't quite enough, and so additional charges would be stored in the turrets and working chambers as well, giving a head start to the stockpile that the now faster ammunition transport system would in theory be able to keep topped up long enough for an exchange of gunnery to conclude. If one could hit fast enough, then again, in theory at least, return fire wouldn't be a problem, because you'd knock out the enemy before they could get your range. To be clear, the general idea of improving fire rates and thus needing more ammunition dated back to before the war and appears to have been spread into some degree throughout the entire Royal Navy, but it was the above combination of factors that ramped up an already somewhat unsafe practice to a disastrous one in the battlecruiser fleet. As the war went on and more fast Queen Elizabeths became available, a system was developed to get the battlecruiser fleet back into the accurate gunnery game by rotating squadrons up to Scapa Flow for practice, and indeed it was this that saw 5th Battle Squadron sail with Beatty and 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron sail with Jellicoe on the day of the battle. The benefit of the gunnery training being seen in Invincible's takedown of Lutzow in her brief window of engagement. It's also notable that one of the reasons Tiger was able to survive the immense battering she endured was that when the new ship arrived in the battlecruiser fleet and was instructed in the various methods prescribed to increase his rate of fire, Tiger's captain promptly smiled, saluted, and then went back to his ship and refused to implement most of them. Indeed, even elsewhere, the feeling was getting around that things had gotten perhaps a little bit too unsafe, as aboard HMS Lion the gunners were also putting in place measures to cut down on the number of propellant charges outside the magazines and closing up some of the flash doors again, which likely helped when it came to the battle. But what these practices resulted in was a system whereby, in the event of an impact that got through the turret roof, sides, or some other part of the turret or barbette arrangement, instead of there being a small flare-up and a few dozen casualties, instead a much larger burn of cordite would occur. This would travel along open ammunition handling systems, and because of the greater pressure caused by the stacked charges, even if the flash doors were closed, They weren't designed to handle this excessive overpressure, and either way the fire would reach the magazines. Once there, unless already flooded, as had happened with Lion's Q turret, the magazine would burn, and the ship would briefly turn into a gigantic pipe bomb. What happened in Lion's turret was also indicative of what could happen elsewhere. The hit itself didn't cause the deadly overflash, but a flare-up of fire sometime afterwards, triggered by a still-hot piece of metal, did. In like manner, both explosions aboard the Indefatigable, the first that blew off the stern and crippled it, and the second that detonated the forward magazines, appear to have been separated from the actual hits, that most likely are the root cause of them, by about 30 seconds or more. Internally, at least, within a week of the battle, the Royal Navy was relatively sure that these practices were the cause, or at least a large part of it, and further interviews of survivors later in the year backed up these findings. Whilst he had let the problem develop under his command, to give him at least some credit, Beatty acted fairly quickly in the aftermath, issuing a number of instructions for improvements, some of them new, others as horrifyingly simple as reinstalling flash protection that had been removed. On the positive side, the Grand Fleet itself was relatively satisfied that its centrally controlled director-firing system was generally superior to the Germans, allowing them to score more hits, although whatever pact with the higher powers that Iron Duke's gunners had was apparently not replicable across the fleet. That said, it was recommended to upgrade the fleet to the newer, larger rangefinders that had been found on the Queen Elizabeths and the R's, whilst also extending director firing provisions to include fitting on smaller ships as well as battleships' secondary batteries. On the German side, there were two main problems they recognised on a technical level: lack of firepower and lack of gun range. In both cases, these were issues the Germans had already to an extent recognised, but the fact that both Tiger and Princess Royal had taken multiple hits from German guns without too much impediment, whilst even a handful of hits from the faulty but considerably larger British shells had rendered a number of their own battlecruisers' combat ineffective despite their greater protection, underlined that the 11-inch gun was not really up to combat with more modern ships of the Royal Navy, and the 12-inch gun was probably marginal. The Bayern class had already moved up to 15-inch guns from the 12-inch guns of the Königs, and on the battlecruiser side, the Hindenburg had already been launched, so little could be done there, but the first 4 of 7 planned Mackensen class were well under construction. This rendered them far too costly to rebuild with a larger armament, although they had already been planned with 350mm or 13.8-inch guns, but the last 3 hadn't been laid down yet, and so the design was modified to the Ersatz York class, for which these vessels would see an upgrade of 15-inch guns to match the Bayerns. Likewise, the plans for Bayern's planned successor, the L-20E Alphas, were dusted off, and the armament was likewise increased, this time from 15-inch guns to 420mm or 16.5-inch guns. When it came to range, again, the gun elevations had already been somewhat increased on a number of ships, but now the new designs were altered to have even higher elevation from the start, and in-service vessels were pulled in to have their own turrets opened up somewhat to further increase maximum elevation and thus range. Hipper had been acutely aware of potentially being outranged in his combats, and whilst Beatty's errors had let him get in range whilst the battlecruiser fleet threw away that particular advantage, the fact that the Queen Elizabeth had been able to engage several minutes before he could even begin to attempt a reply weighed heavily on his post-battle recommendations. In the long run, the High Seas Fleet would rarely emerge looking for a fleet action, and indeed would be withdrawn if it seemed that the Grand Fleet was out. In 1918, when faced with an order to sail against the British, who had now been augmented by the 6th Battle Squadron made up of American warships, the sailors of the High Seas Fleet mutinied instead. The bulk of the fleet would then be brought into Scapa Flow under the guns of the Grand Fleet, later to scuttle itself when it appeared that the fleet was to be surrendered to the victorious Allies. Having served alongside Hipper in 1st Scouting Group, the later-to-be Admiral Raeder would go on to command the Kriegsmarine for most of the Second World War. The Royal Navy would take the lessons of Jutland to heart. Control was loosened, aggression was encouraged, and night fighting training was intensified. Many of the officers present at Jutland would go on to command theatres and fleets in the Second World War, setting a tone for the Royal Navy's conduct in that particular conflict. But never again would massed battle fleets confront each other on the high seas. The Washington Treaty would see the end of such fast battle lines in and of themselves, and the next time the great fleets of the world faced off, it would be with them scattered across the world in a dozen smaller actions, all under the shadow of aircraft and aircraft carriers, which would eventually supplant the battleship as the capital ship of a major navy.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.